So raise your hand if you have been to an Allegra Goodman event at Politics and Prose before, or bought an Allegra Goodman book that was a staff pick at Politics and Prose before. Yeah. So Allegra Goodman is a customer favorite at Politics and Prose. She is a staff favorite, and she is also an everybody I know and everybody I hand sell books to favorite. Her novels, from The Cookbook Collector to Intuition to the first one I ever read, Karaskell Falls, are beloved for their vivid characters, their explorations of faith and the lack thereof, maybe, their elegant prose, and, of course, their great sense of humor, all of which the chalk artist has in spades. It's fun, it's enthralling, kind of made me want to play video games, which I didn't expect. I'm very excited to hear Allegra read from it tonight, so please join me to welcome Allegra Goodman to Politics and Prose.
Oh my goodness, thank you for that beautiful introduction. It's so good to be back here. I haven't been here in a long time, so I have to write my books faster so I can come back more often, more frequently. So I am going to talk a little bit about my book and read you a tiny bit. And I want to show you something first. At the beginning of my book, I want to show you my dedication, which is a little unusual for dedication. As you can see, it's kind of a long dedication with a bunch of names on it instead of just, to my husband or something like that. After you've written a few books, you start running out of relatives, I guess. So, but this book is dedicated to teachers that I've had. It's to my teachers, and it's a bit of a totem pole. It sort of starts with my first grade teacher at the top and goes all the way down through college, and the last name is my thesis advisor in graduate school. And each of these teachers, each of them had a huge effect on me. They're the people that I remember really well, and I don't know if there are teachers here or all of us have had teachers who, sometimes it's those people, they're not necessarily the sweetest ones or the kindest or the nicest ones. They could be the really tough ones that pushed you really hard, are the ones that you remember the most. And that's the case with a lot of these here. I wasn't always the best of students. And the first teacher on this list, Dana Izumi, my first grade teacher at Punahou in Hawaii, she was really tough on me. I'm left-handed, and I had a lot of trouble, even though I became a writer, I had a lot of trouble writing, physically writing. And we wrote with these big blue pencils that were about 2 centimeters in diameter, and on that newsprint with the lines and the dotted line between the big lines. And I just had a lot of trouble with that in first grade. And she used to hold me in at recess and at lunch and work with me and stand over me. And I was a little bit in love with her. She is still alive, actually. She's Japanese, and she had very fair skin and black hair and a page boy, and it was sort of the 70s, and she wore these little mini skirts, and I actually kind of thought she was Snow White. So I really tried, to work with her, but she was one of those people that had a huge effect on me, and every name in this list of people that I dedicated the book to, I could tell you stories about. So this book is very much a book about teaching and learning. I started writing this novel wanting to write about transformation, and I thought about the different ways that people change. In myths, people change into animals or gods or monsters. In real life, you can change physically. You can gain a lot of weight or lose weight or grow taller. You can certainly grow older. Intellectually and spiritually and emotionally, there are many ways that you can change in your life. You can also change ritually by going through a trial or a rite of passage or some kind of vision quest. And my central question when I started writing this book was sort of, how does a person become new? What does that involve? How do you change? And in what ways do you stay the same, even through those changes? And I thought that one of the most interesting and powerful ways that people change is through education. Not just through experiential education in your life, but really education in the classroom. How do those teachers in your life, effect change on you? So this novel, The Chalk Artist, centers on a teacher whose name is Nina Lazar. And she's quite young, and she's educated but unprepared for the classroom. She's one of these young people who dreams about changing lives, but she doesn't quite have the charisma of those teachers in the movies that change lives in the classroom, and I was interested in that. There's a whole genre of literature and film about people who sort of get up there and they take these kids and they whip them into shape, and the kids are like a rabble, and then they start calling the teacher sir, and they kind of like snap to attention, and they start writing beautifully, and they discover calculus. And my thought was, what about a person who really wants to teach and has a lot to give, but isn't really quite stand and deliver material? Like she kind of gets out there and like she can't get the kids to sit down. In fact, it never happened, So I was interested in that, and in sort of bending the rules of that kind of lovely but triumphalist genre of the teacher in the classroom. So Nina has her own motives for teaching. She wants to sort of give back. Her father is the owner of a large gaming company and makes a lot of money on escapism, much of it marketed to young people. And her idea is to do something contra that, to find a way to counteract that, to offer something else to the world. So I'm going to read you a little about Nina. And now I see that my pages are not in order anymore, because the last time I read this, probably I didn't put them back in the right time. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to introduce you to Nina. So this is Nina coming to her classroom, which is in East Cambridge. I live in Cambridge, and this whole novel is set in Cambridge. Lots of local color for those of you who've lived there or visited there. Not just the Cambridge, of Harvard and tourism, but, the Cambridge where people live. So this is Nina. Loaded down with books and folders, Nina shouldered the heavy school door open. Visitors report to the office. This door to remain locked. Our children are our future. Dreading the day ahead, she backed her way into school. Dread was not too strong a word for Wednesdays. She had to start with the wild ones, her American Lit class. Students came unprepared. They're kids, said Mrs. West, her department chair. Some didn't come at all. It's not about you, said Jeff, her teacher corps mentor. Nothing worked for these 11th graders. Her lessons were too difficult, her readings too long, her assignments way too complicated. Good morning, Miss Lazar, said Mrs. West as they stood in the glass front office signing in. All the teachers spoke to one another like that, as if afraid a student might overhear their given names. Are you okay? Nina could only imagine how she looked. Pale, sleep-deprived, floundering. Mrs. West, on the other hand, could walk the halls with total mastery. Her midnight blue manicure, adorned with tiny crystal stars. Mrs. West was famous for her fingernails, for her languages, French and Haitian Creole, for her gorgeous singing voice, for her in-class performances of Romeo and Juliet. Above all, for her way with words. Nina had heard her harangue one boy into submission in the hall. You can stand there and tell me that's your best work, but you know that's not true. Get your butt back in your chair and do it again. The end. That's all. I've got my 11th graders, Nina said. Don't let up. Part coach, part cheerleader, part preacher, Mrs. West admonished Nina. If those kids test you, then you test them back. A sudden buzz and pulsing orange lights. A couple of boys had set off the metal detector, and the school's police officers sprang into action. Over here, you guys. Bags on the table. Keep the line moving. Kids continued shuffling in with their backpacks, their headscarves, their puffy jackets, their attitudes. Nina joined them, climbing the chipped cement steps to her classroom, where she opened her desk and locked her purse inside. Emerson High School was small, diverse, and experimental. There were no exams, only year-end portfolios in which students collected what they considered their best work. The school was open to everyone by lottery, but had a reputation for out-of-the-box kids, those who were artistic or autistic, those with learning differences or special gifts or both at once. Each student was required to keep a journal of personal discovery in a marbled composition book. Required personal discovery seemed like an oxymoron to Nina, but so did many other aspects of the school, a community of learners with metal detectors, a nonlinear curriculum in a rectilinear 1930s building. The wiring was antique, the doorknobs brass. The basement flooded during rainstorms, and in places the roof leaked. There were computers in every classroom, but some rooms had no heat. There were no whiteboards, let alone smartboards. Blackboards were strictly black. Nina took a deep breath and picked up her white chalk. Do now, she wrote on the board. List 3 adjectives Emerson uses to describe Miss? Students were starting to drift in. Miss? Get out your packets, Nina announced. There were no textbooks for Emerson's English classes. Humanities teachers had to develop their own materials. Turn to the essay Nature. Where's your reading? She asked Xavier. I'm not exactly sure. Miss, Rakim approached the board. I think the page is missing or something. Let me see, Nina said. I think my packet is defective. Nina found Nature for him. Have a seat. I looked for it, he said. Rakim, please sit down. He raised his hands in mock surrender as he backed away. Two girls started giggling, and Rakim played to the gallery. Okay, okay. Some people had it, that mysterious report, the ability to catch a student's gaze and hold it, to direct without seeming to direct, to take a joke and lob it back. Nina thought of her own high school teachers, charismatic Mr. Kincaid, witty Mr. Roos. Was it a gift like perfect pitch, or something you could learn? She remembered the silence in Mr. Roos's classroom, the deliberate way he spoke, the way he made you wait for the next word. You shivered when he called on you. She'd done well in training. For 5 weeks at Bowdoin College in black fly season, Nina had learned in theory to teach high school. After long days of role-playing, mini lessons, and crash courses in curriculum development, she would sit with other Teacher Corps recruits in a darkened lecture hall to hear testimonies of transformation. Alumni perched on stools in front of the 800 trainees, and one by one, those alumni stood and walked into the spotlight to tell of raising test scores, breaking through. Is there anything you can do in this world that's more important? Asked one former fellow now working at McKinsey. Is there anything more valuable than the life of a child? All the alumni said that their students had taught them lessons they would carry with them their whole lives. Nina never doubted this, but as her own kids came in dancing, slouching, scuffling playfully, she hoped she could teach them something too. Miss, could you sign this? Layla was holding a pink slip. You're dropping language arts? Switching, said Layla, a picture of innocence. Mr. De Laurentiis thinks I'll learn better with Mrs. West. Of course he does, Nina thought miserably. Mrs. West had been teaching almost 30 years. Nina had been trying for 13 weeks. Mrs. West invented her own acronyms. OWL, own it, work it, learn it. Quack, question underlying assumptions critically and knowledgeably. Nina was still trying to keep her kids in chairs. She bent to sign her name and felt for a moment as though she were signing a confession. I'm a fraud. I have no idea. I failed to reach you. Everyone spoke about epiphanies and transcendent moments, the miracle worker of it all, teacher and student swept up in revelation, spelling into each other's palms, touching the word, grasping the concept, feeling the rush of water. People didn't talk so much about students switching out of your class. So that's Nina. So Nina has, oh shoot, all my pages are mixed up. Okay, here we go. Nina has a bunch of students, too many for her to handle, and one of them is a boy named Aidan, who's the second of the three characters I'm going to introduce to you. And he's locked in this this adolescent struggle between him, teacher and student and parent and teenager, and this sort of torrent of words that he hears in the classroom, and the enchantment of the other worlds that he enters on his screen. And I was really interested in talking about the seductive qualities of a screen. For Aidan, it's video games. For some of us, it's our phones. It's a suck that we feel that it's a way. It takes us away from our everyday material, physical lives and sucks us in. And in his case, he is extremely involved in role-playing games online. And I was really interested in that and what happens with that to his generation, I guess. But I wanted to talk about sort of what that struggle is really about. What's at stake there? It seemed to me that it's not just a struggle between generations or between word and image, although the two do compete with each other. And it's not necessarily that one is good and one is bad, that, books are good, paper is good, screens are bad and horrible. I didn't really think of it that way. I thought of it as a dynamic where these two kind of pull against each other, but they're attracted to each other too. I gave a lot of thought to sort of the attraction of screens, especially for kids, especially for teenagers. And, now there are people who are concerned about video games. It's a huge industry. Graphics get better and better and more absorbing, and these stories, and adults as well as kids are can become addicted to them, or can sort of interfere with your life eventually. But, a generation ago, many of us were watching a lot of really stupid television, and that was sort of the thing that parents worried about. And before that, comic books, which were incredibly violent, and people were very concerned about comic books. And then if you go back far enough, of course, people were really concerned about the novel. The novel was pretty evil when it was not exactly edifying. And there were all kinds of discussions in novels, even in people like Jane Austen, talking about where people discuss, you're reading that novel, you're rotting your brain. Now, of course, we've gotten to the point where, your daughter is reading this horrible pornographic thing about vampires sucking blood out of virgins' necks, and you're like, she's reading a book, I'm so happy my daughter's reading, So we've sort of gotten to that point. So, again, it's not that one genre is good and one is bad, but I'm very interested in sort of the uses and the abuses of imagination. A lot of creativity goes into games. Some novels are really, really crappy, and some games are educational, so all of this is interesting to think about. But Aidan is extremely involved in games, and the games that he's involved with are from the company Arkadia that Nina's father owns. So here's Aidan. Now, sword in hand, he ran through tall grass. Jump! Together they bounded over rushing water. The sky was darkening. Smoke clouded the landscape, smudging hills and trees. Faster and faster he ran, and she flew after him, blue hair streaming. No time to talk, no time to breathe. They raced to the edge of the trackless wood, which crackled with fire. Danger never stopped them. They kept running, weaving through the burning trees. She was a tree elf named Rhea. He was a water elf, Tildor. They came from different realms, but for the past 3 nights they'd quested, traded, and killed together. They'd hunted basilisks, slain dragons, and retrieved 2 diamonds, which Rhea carried in the bag hanging at her waist. She was an amazing marksman and beautiful even for an elf. Her eyes huge, her body supple, her quiver bouncing behind her. Flaming branches crashed around them, the crack of falling trees, then something else, a ripping sound. They whirled around to face a colossus with jagged teeth and claws, a shifting, seething monster, half man, half bear, tar black. He rose up on his hind legs to seize them with clawed hands. They slashed him with their swords, but he reconstituted. Oozing and bubbling, he snatched up his left hand and jammed it on again. Screaming with pain, he retrieved his severed leg and screwed it onto his own bloody stump. Can't finish him with steel, Rhea gasped. Shoot. Arrows can't penetrate. Take it. Let me. The beast heaved up, roaring, and she sent her silver dagger into his eye. The colossus melted like a pile of burning tires. Yes! Breathing hard, she raised her arms in celebration. A diamond glittered at the melting monster's core. As Tildor plucked the jewel, a white nimbus glowed around him. Rhea's voice was hushed. The third. Thorny branches overhead turned into talons, flaming twigs to ashen feathers. The forest phoenix woke, and Rhea and Tildor threw themselves onto the bird's back. The landscape shifted under them as they soared into the air. With each wing beat, the phoenix carried them over smoldering trees and moonlit fields, twisted sunflowers, stubble glowing with white frost. Wind whistled in their ears. That's the keep. Rhea pointed to stone towers in the distance. And there's the... Aidan! Wait for me, he told Rhea. He hurried to his bedroom door. Aidan! He opened the door. What? Take off that headset. He obeyed and lost the music of the wind and air, the hoots of owls and beating wings, the sound of Rhea's voice. On screens, the phoenix soared over tangled woods and frozen ponds in the silver winter night of Everwen. Off-screen, only a computer on a desk, an unmade bed, a backpack open on the floor. Do you know what time it is? His mother demanded. She was home from the night shift at the hospital, and he was supposed to be getting ready for school. Carrie snatched the headset from his hands. Do you even know what day it is? Aidan, look at me when I'm talking to you. He looked at her. Unprotesting, he sat down on his bed. Lately, when his mother screamed at him, he listened. When she said Everwen was sucking the life out of him, he didn't argue. If she asked for remorse, he showed remorse. If she declared, "You're 16 years old, you're wasting your time, you're failing school," he said he was sorry and promised to do better. He said whatever she wanted him to say, and all the time he kept his computer screen in view, the landscape dark and hidden, stars spelling out the name Arkadia. She worked so hard. He said, "I know." She loved him so much. He bent his head. She asked what he thought she should do. He couldn't think of anything. She asked whether he thought life was precious. He said yes. But his mother defined life as singular. He rejected that. He didn't live one life, he lived two. Was it his fault that he preferred the second? In Everwen, he was a healer and an elvish prince, a leader of his company. He had a pile of gold and a sword worth 80 marks, a magic ring, a diamond flask filled with a hatchling dragon's blood. He had fashioned his own gear, chainmail, silver helmet, enchanted boots. He trained for transformation. If he wanted to run like a deer, he could become one. If he quested underwater, he could be a beaver, otter, or eel. And now in Everwen, he fought with Rhea at his side. Meanwhile, in the outside world, he was just a skinny kid, blue-eyed, dirty blonde, ignored at school. His friends were equally unpopular. Jack was a water elf, but in real life he took college-level math. Liam was an amazing warrior, but in real life he smoked so much pot, Carrie refused to let him in the door. Aidan's mother worried about drugs and games and bad influences, not to mention the transmission on the car, the second mortgage on the house. They lived in a two-family. Priscilla, the piano teacher, paid rent on the other side of the living room wall. But Carrie owned the place. If the roof leaked or the pipes burst, Carrie was responsible. She slept mornings and worked nights, and in her world, every day was like the last. No quests awaited, no treasure maps arrived, no burning trees turned into birds, no cities into stone. So that is Aidan. So the third character that I want to introduce you to is, I guess, the third point in this sort of love triangle in the book. So we have Nina, the teacher, Aidan, the student, who is not such a student at this point, and there's a chalk artist in the book who's the title character. Nina falls in love with a chalk artist, and his name is Colin, and he's in many ways her opposite. She's really anxious about doing good in the world, and he is really not. She's serious, and he's very playful. She believes that art has a purpose, and he doubts that. He's very gifted, but he wears his talent lightly. He's skilled, but he resists meaning and responsibility and permanence. He loves chalk the most of all the mediums that he works in because it doesn't last. And this book is very much about the way these three characters change each other and the way each enters the other's worlds. So there's the world of the classroom, the world of Arkadia, and the world of Colin and his art. So the last passage I want to read to you, Colin draws for Nina for the first time. He takes her to his mother's house in Cambridge, and he takes her down to the basement to show her his chalkboards. Guiding Nina past the toys and rusty bicycles, he led her to 7 rolling blackboards, dark, old-fashioned, like the ones at school. Rising from the basement clutter, they stood mounted in wooden frames with casters underneath. Quickly, he took a wet towel and wiped the board in front, rubbing the surface clean of every bit of dust and dirt so that it gleamed in the dim light. Then he reached down to excavate a box brimming with chalk. "What would you like?" "What do you mean?" "What do you want?" Focused, almost fierce, he picked up a piece of chalk. She hesitated. "Well, what do you like to draw?" "Everything." Already his hand was moving across the board. "Horses." He found a clear space and drew a horse with mane and tail streaming. "Birds." A pair of white swans glided from his hand, their long necks curving, reflections rippling in a glassy lake. "When I was a kid, I liked castles." In seconds, he drew crenellated towers and pennants flying, drawbridges opening. "Now I draw people." With one fluid line, he drew a woman lying on a beach. No, on a bed. It was Nina, leaning back, supporting herself with her elbows. That was her hair falling over her shoulders. Those were her arms. Colin. She had never seen anyone draw so fast, so well. His horses turned their heads to look at each other. His castle stood on foundations of rough stone. His sketch of Nina captured her tender expression, her soft, mussed hair. He stood back for just a moment to admire his work, and then he wiped it all away. Castle, swans, horses. Nina's portrait vanished, and in their place he drew the hemlock in front of his mother's house. He worked with thick and thin edges, smudging snow onto the branches with his hand, outlining telephone wires in white. What else? What else? She'd like to know how he drew swans so easily. How did he toss off castles in 5 seconds? He was so quick. He told her about his asphalt water lilies and his sidewalk Van Goghs. But she'd been to street fairs, glanced at sidewalk art on Church Street. His work was something else. His art was quick, but never crude or facile. His drawings were lively, streamlined, beautifully observed. As mimics captured gestures in performance, he drew essential details: the curve of a neck, the soft dent in a pillow, the arc of a careening sled. With each sketch, Nina felt a shock of recognition. He was drawing the hill at Dennehy Park, the dwarf pines weighed down with snow. How did he do it? He seemed to steal from the world. By now, he held 4 pieces of chalk in his hand. Tell me what you want. A cat. A white cat capered atop a brick wall, and then a calico on a windowsill, and a dark cat with white feet and white nose crouching in tall grass. What else? He never hesitated as his chalk moved across the board. Sometimes he erased a line or smudged it with his hand, but he seemed to have a picture in his mind. Another cat emerged, a slinky, half-grown animal, ginger with green eyes. Go crazy, he told Nina. Ask for furniture. He drew his mother's kitchen table with 6 chairs, or tennis. He sketched himself, long, sinuous, jumping up to serve. He looked at her. I'm showing off. Don't stop. She remembered his words. I have nothing to say. But it seemed to her the opposite was true. He had everything to say. What else? He pressed. Wait, she said. Just let me look. He had charmed her, delighted her before. She had enjoyed him for himself. He didn't need to impress her. But to her chagrin, she saw him differently now. It should not have mattered, but it did. She saw his gift. No, she begged, don't erase your pictures. With a defiant smile, he took his rag and erased his art to start again. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about this book or other books or writing or...
Hi.
Oh.
Did you feel that this book in particular, the pacing of this book was very different from your previous books?
Oh, good question. Have you read it? Did you feel that way when you read it? Oh, that's interesting. You know, I guess each book has its own style and its own mood, voice, and did you feel the pacing was faster or like the video games?
It was moving very quickly.
Yeah.
In the early books, we're in a Jewish community that's fairly insular.
Yeah.
And then intuition, we move into academic research institutions, cookbook. So this book, to me, just seems like it's flying. And, I don't know anything about video games, but I read The Knicks by Nathan Hill.
Uh-huh.
He gets into all that. So my only experience with video games is through the...
And it's the best way. You should just experience your books. Yeah. It's safer that way.
So I guess the question is, did the book and the subject matter influence pacing, or did your view of this book develop so that you were controlling the pacing on top of the story?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's sort of that chicken and egg type of thing. I think to some extent the content dictates the form a bit, you know, and the video games sort of lent themselves to that a little bit. But I was also controlling it. And it's also interesting, you know, this book has a real tension between kind of this visual, very quick visual, luscious kind of world in Arkadia, and then the world of words that Nina inhabits and proselytizes, you know. And they have different paces and different moods. One thing that I kind of enjoyed, you know, when I did some research, you know, I talked to people who create video games and work in that industry and stuff when I prepared to write this book. And one comment really stuck with me, which is somebody who worked on video games said, by the time your book comes out, anything that you can imagine in terms of like the graphics of video games we will have on the market. You know, it's not a problem. And I was like, oh, really? And I took that as a challenge. So, you know, the technology later on in this book that they develop is not on the market yet. And I just thought I'd make the graphics, you know, as compelling as I possibly could and show that sort of the seductive power of this visual stuff and that it wins, you know, it wins people over. But it's all being described in words, so in the end, I have the trump card because it's still my book, right? So it's like words are describing the images. So.
you bring any preconceptions to the book when it came to classroom settings? I don't know how long you had left K through 12 world and coming back to it, and maybe what your impressions were.
Oh yeah, thank you. Good question. I came to it with some conceptions of classroom settings. I actually spent 6 years volunteering in a Boston public school doing teacher development, a school that was much more dysfunctional than the one that I described in Cambridge. But I spent a lot of time in classrooms with the teachers, and especially with teachers who were having trouble controlling the students. And I was really interested in kind of the theater of the high school classroom and what was going on there. So I was very much informed by what I saw in that school, and also by some of the younger teachers who were really sort of flailing, like trying and flailing, and just had a lot of information, a lot of heart, and a lot to give, but it wasn't coming across, and that failure to connect that happens. So it's very much informed by that experience that I'd had in that school.
I guess I'm also interested in your process, and I've read all your previous novels, and I would describe you as an author who is creates very evocative settings, that the different locales of the books are part of what I keep with me. And I'm curious, when you sit down to start a new book, whether you're starting with the setting. You talked a little bit about the character Nina, and you were really curious about how she navigated this, not quite being a stellar teacher. It seems to me most authors begin with plot, and I'm curious whether you're coming at your books from a different angle.
I definitely am one of those authors who comes from character first, probably, and character and setting kind of go together. People are shaped by where they live, and I was interested in the kind of people that live in Cambridge, and I've lived in Cambridge now 20 years, like not as a student, but as a person, and I've lived in both East Cambridge and West Cambridge, and one of the things that I'm interested in this book is that a city can have many neighborhoods and many worlds within the city, if you want to sort of talk about worlds. And Cambridge, of course, we have kind of the myth that we're very integrated and we're like everybody, and there are class differences, in Cambridge even. Probably the more pronounced because we don't acknowledge them. So there's that happening in this book as well. And I was interested so Cambridge itself as a city is a character in the book. But I started with, actually the character of the mother was my first character that I came up with in this book, and the twins, her twins and her struggle to reach them, and then thought of Nina and Colin after that. And, like my process is just a lot of observation and listening and watching people. And sometimes it's watching people when they know I'm watching them, and sometimes when they don't know. I did both.
So just if I'm following, you're saying you're creating the characters and then you're kind of throwing them together and listening to see how they...
Then where is the connection to the plot? So I will answer that. And I had this, I really think about what the characters want, what each of them wants, and the plot grows out from that. So when I wrote Intuition was the first time I really thought of it in those terms, and I was struggling with the plot of Intuition, and I wrote down each character, and I wrote a little biography of each main character, and then I wrote what he or she wanted at the end. And all those statements of what he or she wanted, they conflicted with each other, and from that conflict grew the plot of the book. So the plot really comes from the characters themselves. It's not like I have, like some books that are more of a mystery genre or other genres, you might start with a plot, almost like a puzzle, and then the characters become variables in that puzzle, but mine is the opposite approach, if that makes sense.
It does. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
In your books, it seems like your earlier books treat or address a Jewish milieu more than your more recent books do. So I wonder, when you start writing a book, is that a conscious choice that you make?
Oh, that's a good question. It's not really a conscious choice. It's true that some of my earlier books are sort of more ostensibly about the Jewish community, a Jewish community, or Jewish themes. But sort of stepping back from that, all my books, I'm very interested in sort of questions of belief and of doubt and of ritual, and which are sort of religious questions, but take different forms in my different books. My book about scientists, in which most of the scientists there are not, religiously observant at all, although many are Jewish, is very much a book about the rituals of the lab, the generational conflict and family conflict of a workplace, and very much about doubt and when you should doubt yourself and when you should sort of carry on and believe, and so in a larger sense, my books sort of have that continuity to them. In terms of like defining yourself as a Jewish novelist or writing, I think I'm certainly a Jewish novelist, but not all my books are Jewish novels. And I don't think that you have to be Jewish to write a Jewish novel either. A great example would be somebody like George Eliot, who wrote Daniel Deronda, which I think is the great Jewish novel. And she wasn't Jewish at all, of course. But she did all this research into Judaism. She was interested in the Jewish question in the 19th century. She was interested in the question of where Jews would live and sort of, single-handedly kind of inventing Zionism before Zionism was invented, and because of the power of her research. And as a Jewish novelist, I found her example extremely encouraging and inspiring. And I thought, that means I can do research and write about anything too, right? Any other questions? Oh, here we go.
This is sort of a related question to the last one. In the Politics and Prose newsletter, in your description, it mentioned, as you did in the Cookbook Collector and Intuition, Goodman vividly conveys the dynamics of specific workplaces and shows how identity is deeply bound up with the work people do. Was this a conscious choice of yours as well, or how did the workplace?
I am really interested in the work people do. If you are Jane Austen and your characters are gentlemen and ladies who don't work, then the work you do, if you're a girl, is to get married, and if you're a man, sometimes you go to London to do business, whatever that means, and you write letters, But the people I write about are people who live in our time, and I think work is a huge part of identity. And I'm really interested in work. I'm interested in people finding, in the question of how you find your vocation in life, as a woman or a man. I'm interested in how a young person finds a path. I'm interested in education. So it is a conscious decision that I don't just want to write sort of a domestic novel about, people getting married, or a domestic novel about just a family, or family in crisis, or a family where somebody dies, or a family where a child disappears, or one of those. So work does become an important plot point in life, and because to me that's real. That's what I see around me. People are passionate about their work, and work is what connects you to your community or disconnects you. And in this case, your work can be problematic, morally problematic, as Colin finds out. And it's sort of like, do you believe in the work that you're doing? When I went and interviewed people who worked at a gaming company, I met a lot of scientists who spent their lives working on games, and they were physicists by training, or they had a background in biology, and they had some ambivalence about what they were doing, which was really interesting to me. Not that they thought there was anything wrong with games, but that they were working on the physics of an imaginary world instead of working on the physics of the real world. They were thinking about like how hard somebody would thud if he fell off the cliff, to make it plausible in the game. Of course, I sympathize with all of these questions because that's what I do too. I feel a kinship, So I'm really interested. Sort of, what is your role in? What is your purpose in your life? Yeah. So thank you. I will happy to sign books for you.